and delighted to be here again with all you folks for our fourth session of our look at banned books. And as you probably are well aware, George Orwell's dystopian novel 1984 has repeatedly been banned and challenged for its social and political themes as well as for sexual content. Additionally, in 1981, the book was challenged in Jackson County, Florida, for being pro-communist. In his novel, first published in 1949, Orwell writes of an omnipresent government that sucks away individuality and life from its citizens. One of those citizens is Winston Smith. Smith's job is to alter articles to fit the liking of the party and to revere its leader, Big Brother. Orwell showcases the way that Communist Party, for example, alter humanity and history. One of the most popular quotes from the book is, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." Because 1984 offers insight into those under the leadership of oppressive regimes, the book has been banned and even burned in several different countries. Well, in today's banned book class, we will hear from Dr. Phillip Wegner, the Marston Milbauer Eminent Scholar and Professor of English at the University of Florida, where he has taught since 1994. He's the author of numerous essays and also many books, Imaginary Communities, Utopia, The Nation, and the Spatial Histories of Modernity. Currently, he's hard at work on a new book with the working title, A Return to the Scene of Postmodern, or Why 1984 Wasn't Like 1984. Please welcome Dr. Phillip Wegner.
Great, thank you everyone. I really appreciate the great attendance on this hot summer day. I guess it's good to get inside. Also, I'd like to thank Mallory.
And we have almost 30 online there, Dr. Wegner.
Wow,
so you have a nice
incredible.
audience here.
And welcome online audience as well. I should say, actually, for the outset, for both people who are here and people who are online, if anyone wants to continue the conversation after today, please feel free to drop me an email at my UFL address, very easy, pwegner, my name, at ufl.edu. I wanted to begin by thanking Mallory for the invitation to talk to you today for a little while about a book that I realize has been central to me throughout my career as both a student and a scholar. And I've done a number of these kind of events over the years, talking about 1984, its changing reception. And I was tempted, I have to admit, I'm just back from a wonderful vacation in California in the mountains, and I was tempted to simply repeat one of these past talks, but I decided to try something new today. So we'll see how it goes. I wanted to begin with a little show and tell here, and feel free if anyone wants to take a look at these things at any time during the talk. A number of interesting items here. This is the 1949, summer 1949 Book of the Month Club edition of 1984. And in some ways, the Book of the Month Club edition is more important, especially in the US, than the original first edition. It was published initially in the US on June 13th, 1949, and then the Book of the Month Club edition was issued that July. It's through this that the book's real influence and popularity in the United States began. And very significantly, the publishers of the Book of the Month Club originally demanded that Orwell remove the excerpts from Goldstein's book, the long book that Winston Smith, you might recall, reads, that gives him the history and the basic theoretical foundations of Oceania. And far more importantly for Orwell, they also demanded the removal of the Newspeak appendix. Orwell was adamant that these things were integral to his book, and he refused to allow publication of it, even though it would have meant the loss of something like 40,000 pounds for him, which was a lot of money in those days. And thankfully for history that the publishers refused. And I'll talk about this issue at the very end of my talk and the importance of the Newspeak appendix for reading the book. I also have up here, since I just came back from California, my first edition of Jack London's The Iron Heel from 1908. The Iron Heel was one of those absolutely essential precursors to 1984. It's about a capitalist oligarchy creating a kind of proto-fascist dictatorship of the United States. Orwell knew this book very well. In 1940, he wrote a very interesting review of the book. I also have here the beautiful 50th anniversary edition of 1984, this beautiful illustrated edition that was published by Seeker and Warburg, the original British publishers. An interesting story that I'll talk about too, that involved these various editions of the book. And finally, a couple books of mine that I'll mention in a second, and then some wonderful cards that I printed out from an organization that was founded in 2006 called, a satirical organization, I should say, called Students for an Orwellian Society. And this one of them, which I had at my office door for a long time, was Report Thought Crime. It's your patriotic duty. Have you seen questions asking, lack of support for the US military, concern for Iraqi civilians, outright dissent? And I'll talk about these things a little bit again in my talk today. So please feel free to take a look at these things. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Orwell has been a very important figure for me throughout my academic career. My dissertation, which I completed in the fall of 1993, and my first book, Imaginary Communities, which came out in 2002, come to their climax with a long discussion of 1984. At the time, my dissertation director said that he thought this was the best thing that I had written up to that point. So it was very, very important to me. In my second book, Life Between Two Deaths, 1989 to 2001, U.S. Culture in the Long 90s, which is a book on the 1990s and post 9/11 American culture, also touches on Orwell because, as I'll suggest in a moment, we saw a really significant rise of interest in 1984. Some of you may recall after the events of 2001. And then this book also deals with another issue that's been very, very important to me, and I'll touch on today too, that of adaptations and remakes of various literary texts. And then in my most recent book, which I also threw up on the table there, Invoking Hope, Theory and Utopia in Dark Times, which came out in 2020, I'm really interested in the deep relationship between the teaching of practices of reading in the university after the Second World War and the concerns for democracy. And this is a theme that's, in fact, I want to suggest, central for Orwell as well. And as finally, as Mallory mentioned, I'm returning to 1984 directly in my current book manuscript, A Return to the Scene of the Postmodern, or Why 1984 Wasn't Like 1984. Does anyone recognize the subtitle of my book? I'll show you this in one moment. This is a book about, in fact, a big array of fiction, films, cultural theory and other events that were produced in the year 1984. It was the year I turned 20 when I was an undergraduate living in LA. LA features prominently in this book as well. And one of the chapters is about reading 1984 in the year 1984, where I discuss a number of really interesting adaptations or remakes of 1984. These include Martin Amis's brutal satirical novel, Money, which I highly recommend, wherein the central character, the British commercial and pornography director John Self, happens to read the novel, and he proclaims how much he enjoyed it. And John Self says, quote, 1984 and I were getting on famously. A no-frills setup run without sentiment, snobbery, or cultural favoritism. Airstrip 1 seemed like my kind of town. I saw myself as an idealistic young corporal in the thought police. In addition, there was the welcome sex interest and all those rat tortures to look forward to. Another very important text, which I'll show a clip from today, is Michael Radford's film adaptation that came out at the end of 1984 and was in fact filmed in central London, primarily around the Docklands, in exactly the months that the events of the novel were supposed to take place. And finally, we have what's perhaps the most well-known of all these adaptations, the shortest, and which I'll show right now. Let's see what the first one is. Yeah, perfect. No? Oh, could you make it full screen? Thank you.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory thoughts. Unification of thoughts is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people. One will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
This commercial, even though it was only shown twice, once at the meeting for the Apple executives and financiers, the other during the 1984 Super Bowl, is often voted the most influential, most important commercial of all time. It's so important that if you've ever seen the film life story of Steve Jobs, the event is restaged, and you can in fact watch. There's actual documentary footage of Steve Jobs showing the commercial at the shareholders meeting. It's really, really interesting, and talk about that all day today. And I'll come back to it very briefly in a little bit. Now, another central aspect of my scholarship has been, and teaching, has been science fiction, and especially the subgenre of the dystopia, which the pioneering bibliographic scholar Lyman Tower Sargent very concisely defines as, quote, a literary practice that offers a vision of a non-existent society described in considerable detail and normally located in time and space that the author intended a contemporaneous reader to view as considerably worse than the society in which that reader lived. Now, while 1984 did not create the practice of the dystopia, I've already suggested that Orwell was very familiar with London's The Iron Heel. He also knew the Russian author Yevgen Zamyatin's We, which was written in 1921, immediately banned and not published until in English in 1924. Huxley's Brave New World. All of these were read and discussed by Orwell a number of times. While he may not have invented the practice, his 1984 is consistently the most well-known example. And the form of the dystopia has been especially important for writers in the United Kingdom. I've argued in the past, to cite myself here, that the dystopian narrative is the most significant subgenre of the novel to emerge from Great Britain in the last century. In the Modern Library 1998 list of the 100 best novels written in English and published in the 20th century, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, George Orwell's 1984, William Golding's Lord of the Flies, and Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange all appear in the top 65. Brave New World in the 5th slot is the highest rated novel by a non-Irish or non-American author. 1984 comes in 13th place in that list. All four appear again in Radcliffe's Rivals 100 Best Novels, The Lord of the Flies, 1984, and Brave New World at 8th, 9th, and 16th places, respectively. Again, being the highest rated works of British fiction on the list. And finally, making the list of Time Magazine's 100 best English language novels published between 1923 and 2005, the anniversary of Time Magazine, again are included 1984, Lord of the Flies, A Clockwork Orange, and with the additions of Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, which I just talked about in a lecture in Brazil, unfortunately an online lecture in Brazil, a Zoom lecture, and Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen from 1987, the only graphic novel to be so honored. Now, while such lists are, of course, no indication of merit, I think they very much do attest to the continued power and interest of the dystopian form, something that's seen a real revival in the 21st century. Now, moreover, I think a real case could be made that Orwell's final novel, and he died just 7 months after its publication in the summer of 1949, and which is something very, very important to acknowledge here. Orwell was adamant that this wasn't a book of prediction. This wasn't about what he thought the world would be like in 1984. Rather, he simply used this as an arbitrary date, the inversion of the last two numbers in the year he was writing, this 1948. History will tell us something very, very different here. But I would suggest that Orwell's novel can in many ways be considered the most well-known and influential work of literature in the last century, one that provided central coordinates by which people all over the globe came to understand their world. His work introduced a number of phrases into the common parlance. We all know what Big Brother or doublethink means, even if we haven't read the novel. And indeed, perhaps no other author's name has been so specifically associated with a particular vision of the world. In fact, I did a quick Google search last night in Google News, and the top 6 stories that came up representing both sides of the political spectrum had the headlines: Ron DeSantis rejects Orwellian doublespeak about the economy. January 6th committee reveals Trump's Orwellian attempts to win the election. We live in an Orwellian hellscape, libertarian think tank economist Phillip tweeted on Thursday. Orwellian facial recognition cameras in UK stores challenged. The pure Orwellian doublespeak of Governor DeSantis' Stop the Woke Act, and James Langford goes fully Orwellian in a new border rant. Now, all this raises for me some really interesting questions. How many of the people who are using these phrases and referring to 1984 have in fact actually read it. Now, this, of course, in turn means we need to specify what we mean by having read something. The French critic Pierre Bayard, in his really wonderful 2007 book, I highly recommend it here, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. Bayard argues that we're always engaging in three forms of what he calls non-reading, which is something very different for Bayard than not reading. And he identifies these three practices as hearing about books, skimming books, and forgetting books. His first practice, I think, hearing about, likely defines many of these readers of 1984, while the remaining ones, which I very much include myself, have at various times skimmed and forgotten it. Now, for Bayard, this isn't at all a negative thing, because it's precisely this reality that allows books to be continuously created and written anew. And I think Orwell's novel is a superb illustration of exactly what Bayard's talking about. But this said, there are a lot of different ways to do these activities, some better than others. And it's some of the various versions of these rewritings of 1984 that I'd like to touch on today. Now, this in turn brings me back to the quote from Orwell that was used as the epigraph for this really exciting lecture series that's been going on, and I guess continues one more meeting for the last few weeks. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Now, I'm going to ask, I'm not doing a poll here, but I would ask how many of us have actually read the essay where this quote comes from. And I have to confess that until a few days ago, I would have been one of those people. I had heard about it because of the quote, but I had not read it in the conventional sense. And in fact, the quote appears everywhere, all over the internet. But actually finding a source for it takes a little more work. And this is also something very interesting I'll talk about in a second here. Orwell, in fact, wrote it in 1944 as part of the concluding paragraph of a never published preface to his second most well-known book, the satirical parable Animal Farm. From 1945. And in fact, the manuscript of this preface, and it's quite clear if you read it, and it's readily available online now. The Orwell Foundation webpage has actually posted it under the title, The Freedom of the Press. That it's quite clear that the reasons why Orwell decided, given the political situation of the late days of the Second World War, that he decided to not publish this preface. But it's a really interesting essay because in it, most of it, Orwell focuses on what he sees among contemporary British intellectuals as what he calls the prevailing orthodoxy, an uncritical admiration of the Soviet Russia. Now, it's this, he claims, that led nearly to the refusal, and in fact, the refusal by a number of publishers to publish Animal Farm. So later in his essay, Orwell observes, quote, "This tolerance or plain dishonesty means much more than admiration for Russia that happens to be fashionable at this moment. Quite possibly that particular fashion will not last. For all I know, by the time the book is published, my view of the Soviet regime may be the generally accepted one, but what use would that be in itself? To exchange one orthodoxy for another is not necessarily an advance." And I think the line really, really important. "The enemy is the gramophone mind, whether or not one agrees with the record that is being played at the moment." Now, this precedes the concluding paragraphs of the essays, which begin, I am well acquainted with all the arguments against freedom of thought and speech, the arguments which claim that it cannot exist, and the arguments which claim that it ought not to. I answer simply that they don't convince me, and that our civilization over a period of 400 years has been founded on the opposite notice. If I had to choose a text to justify myself, I should choose the line from Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty. The word ancient emphasizes the fact that intellectual freedom is a deep-rooted tradition without which our characteristic Western culture could only doubtfully exist. From that tradition, many of our intellectuals are visibly turning away. They have accepted the principle that a book should be published or suppressed, praised or damned, not on its merits, but according to political expediency. And others who do not actually hold this view assent to it from sheer cowardice. Then immediately after the quote used as for the epigraph, Orwell then concludes the essay, quote, the common people still vaguely subscribe to that doctrine and act on it. In our country, it is not the same in all countries. It was not so in Republican France, and it is not so in the USA today. It is the liberals who fear liberty and the intellectuals who want to do dirt on the intellect. It is to draw attention to the fact that I have written this preface. Now, I find this document really fascinating because I think even more so than Animal Farm, it casts a lot of light on Orwell's mindset when he was writing 1984. But what really caught my attention here is the fact that throughout this, what Orwell primarily focuses on is direct forms of censorship. The suppression of anyone's right to speak or to write what they want to. And while this is, of course, as we're all familiar, very much a real issue today, part of the greatness of 1984 lies in its portrayal of much more subtle and hence even more dangerous forms of censorship. Indeed, I want to argue that in his last years, Orwell realized that while the right to tell people what they do not want to hear is absolutely necessary for democracies to flourish, it is not sufficient. What is also required is the cultivation of a much more difficult skill than the ability to speak. That is the capacity to listen. The capacity and willingness to listen is the foundation of any community, democratic especially. Otherwise, all we're left with is the assertion and competition of individual opinions. Now, all of this leads me, I should have shown another clip today, but scheduling reasons, recalls one of my all-time favorite quotes, and I repeat in almost every one of my classes, and it comes from the 1999 film adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's novel Fight Club. In fact, his most recent novel, Palahniuk complains bitterly about the fact that no one reads his novel now. They only see the film. And it comes in the form of a dialogue, but I'll just repeat it here as a statement. When people think you're dying, they really, really listen to you instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. And I think, again, this has something central to do with 1984. Now, 1984 has, of course, as Mallory mentioned, been the subject of direct censorship, most famously in the Soviet Union, where Stalin banned it in 1950, right after its publication, as he took it as a satire based on his leadership. And it wasn't until 1990 that it was legalized in the Soviet Union and re-released even then, though, after some serious editing. It's been far less directly banned in the United States, although interestingly, we find it online, as Mallory also said, consistently referred to as one of the most regularly banned books. And indeed, thank you. It's almost if we set this up. I always tell my students, oh, here, I'll give you the $5 I promised you for that setup today. One of the most common things that's repeated is the story about Jackson County in Florida, banning it in 1984 because they said, quote, it was pro-communist and contained explicit sexual matter. You see this citation proliferate endlessly across the internet. I could not find any direct citation to news stories or other documentation that this actually occurred. And interestingly, exactly on that grounds, it was removed from the Wikipedia page discussing Jackson County. Of course, Jackson County, for those of you who don't know, has a much greater claim to infamy because it was the home for many years of the notorious Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys that was finally closed in the summer of 2011 and has subsequently been revealed was they exhumed many tortured and murdered bodies of boys. It's become the subject of one of the most extraordinary novels about Florida released in recent years, Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, which again, I strongly recommend. Now, a number of these sites also cite another supposed fact. The book was first banned in 1984 by the American Library Association because of its bleak warning of totalitarian government and censorship. And yet this second quote, there's no evidence, right, that this in fact ever happened. And the American Library Association is precisely the group who publishes the lists regularly of the most banned books. And that's my guess is in fact what happened, is that they cited a library that was banning it for these reasons, and someone read this as being about what the American Library Association was recommending. Now, this is really interesting to me because this goes back to exactly what Orwell was talking about in his notion of the gramophone mind. Because what we're seeing here is the way in which facts, right, now become established solely through their circulation on these mass media forms. And this is exactly what Winston Smith is doing at the Ministry of Truth, right? And in some ways, it's this practice of a kind of censorship of information, the creation of these false circulations the circulation of these false truths that 1984 is really centrally about. Now, this leads into another, right, I think, practice of censorship, which is the unwillingness or even the inability to actually read what Orwell wrote. And this leads to all kinds of readings that find in it exactly what people want. And again, very parallel to the internet. Any belief, any idea you have right now, any recipe, which I most often find, you can find a version of it on the internet. Now, this is exactly what the dates that I gave in my title were referring to. Here is the various moments that were sort of high points. I'm just taking sort of arbitrary dates in some ways to indicate the different receptions and the different readings of him. So the first date, 1950, is of course the earliest reception of the book, which is taking place in the context of the Cold War. A few years after its publication, the great Jewish, Polish, British intellectual Isaac Deutscher, who himself was no friend of the Soviet Union, wrote, quote, "Few novels written in this generation have obtained popularity as great as that of George Orwell's 1984. Few, if any, have made a similar impact on politics. The title of Orwell's book is a political byword. And again, how quickly this happened, right? The terms coined by him, newspeak, old speak, mutability of the past, big brother, ministry of truth, thought police, crime think, double think, hate week, etc., have entered the political vocabulary. They occur in most newspaper articles and speeches denouncing Russia and communism. Television and the cinema have familiarized many millions of viewers on both sides of the Atlantic with the menacing face of Big Brother and the nightmare of a supposedly communist Oceania. The novel has served as a sort of ideological superweapon in the Cold War. As in no other book or document, the convulsive fear of communism, which has swept the West since the end of the Second World War, has been reflected and focused in 1984, which Deutscher had known Orwell's preface, because what he's talking about here, again, is the gramophone mind here. Now, this is beautifully borne out in the April 26, 1953 Theater Guild on the Air radio adaptation of the novel, which again, you can find this on the Theater Guild on the Air website and listen to this, and really incredible. The broadcast begins with the then very well-known radio journalist, Kenneth Banghart, proclaiming, quote, George Orwell's great novel, 1984, deals with the most terrifying subject in the news today, the threat to all free men of communism or totalitarian domination in any form. Orwell creates for us a picture of what life might be should the totalitarian forces succeed with their plan to become the Earth's masters. It is fiction that projects into a kind of prophetic reporting of the future. It is our blessing that we can see it so and thus alert ourselves. Now, the irony in all of this is that in his very famous, not at that time famous enough, late essay, Why I Write, from 1947, Orwell maintained, quote, every line of serious work that I've written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism as I understand it. Now, in the height of the Cold War, any of the distinctions Orwell's trying to make here had become impossible. Now, at the same time, the well-known New York intellectual Lionel Trilling, in perhaps the first U.S. review, I haven't verified this, but it's actually right as the book's been published on the June 18th, 1949 issue of The New Yorker, Trilling already marks a certain ambiguity in the work. Trilling maintains, quote, by now it must be clear that 1984 is in large part an attack on Soviet communism. However, in a really important early sign of a shift to come, Trilling continues, yet to read it as this and as nothing else would be to misunderstand the book's aims. The settled and reasoned opposition to communism that Orwell expresses is not to be minimized, but he is not undertaking to give us the delusive comfort of moral superiority to an antagonist. He does not separate Russia from the general tendency of the world today. He is saying, indeed, something no less comprehensive than this, that Russia, with its idealistic social revolution, now developed into a police state, is but the image of the impending future, and that the ultimate threat to human freedom may well come from our democratic culture. To many liberals, this idea will be incomprehensible, or if it is understood at all, it will be contemned by them as both foolish and dangerous. We have dutifully learned to think that tyranny manifests itself chiefly, only solely, in the defense of private property, and that the profit motive is the source of all evil. And certainly Orwell does not deny that property is powerful or that it may be ruthless in self-defense. But he sees that, as the tendency of recent history goes, property is no longer in anything like the strong position it once was, and that will and intellect are playing a greater and greater part in human history. To many, this can only look like a clear gain. We naturally identify ourselves with will and intellect. They are the very stuff of humanity, and we prefer not to think of their exercise in any except an ideal way. But Orwell tells us that the final oligarchical revolution of the future, which, once established, could never be escaped or countered, will be made not by men who have property to defend, but by men of will and intellect, by the new aristocracy of bureaucrats, scientists, trade union organizers, publicity experts, sociologists, teachers, journalists, and professional politicians. Now, it's this view, I think, that really comes to dominate readings of the novels by the late 1960s, and this is my second date, 1968. On the one hand, there was the sense that Orwell's novel was useful in illustrating the Puritanism and anti-individualism of dominant US culture in the post-war world. But on the other hand, the novel was still condemned by some on the New Left for what was understood to be its broad-based attacks on any alternatives to Western capitalism. Now, as the long 60s gave way to the neoconservative turn of the 1980s, interest in the books seemed to hit, in fact, its all-time low. While there was a resurgence in what was seen as the important year, 1984, that I was talking about it earlier, much of this, as the commercial very concisely illustrates, and as the film does in another way, what these new readings of this story were most interested in is what they took to be the book's obsolescence. The common assumption by 1984, this is my argument in the book, is that the total state, be it the total state of the Soviet Union, the US, or IBM, as in the commercial, would be defeated by the free market, something that the fall of the Soviet Union 5 years later would seem to indicate was true. Now, whether this was considered freedom or an even more absolute form of domination, and as the political theorist Francis Fukuyama infamously put it in the year 1989, the end of history itself, this would be the new topic of debate. And Orwell's novel seemed to contribute very little to this new set of concerns. So the next date that comes into play here for me, 1993, is a solely selfish one, because this is the date that I defended my dissertation. And I'm writing in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War and trying to make a case for the continued interest in Orwell's book, something that had real consequences for me that I'll talk about in a second. By 2003, my next date, however, this signaled that the waning of interest in the book was actually going to be short-lived. And with the US-Iraq war made possible by the events of September 11, 2001, interest again rose dramatically in the book. On the one hand, we get people like Christopher Hitchens in his 2002 book, Why Orwell Matters, who uses Orwell's anti-totalitarianism as a defense of the contemporary war on terror or war on Islam. On the other hand, we get the Los Angeles Actors Gang's 2006 dramatic adaptation written by Michael Gene Sullivan and directed by Tim Robbins. Robbins is also, I should mention here, the writer and director and producer of a really fantastic film I just watched recently again with my son about censorship in the 1930s, The Cradle Will Rock from 1999. And in fact, this stage version, some of you, I don't know if anyone here saw it with me, came to Gainesville in 2007 at the Phillip Center, and I was asked to give an introductory theater talk. Now, the Houston Chronicle's review makes the aim of this Actors Gang's reading of 1984 very clear in their review, which is entitled Actors Gangs 1984 is Pointedly Topical. And in the review, the authors write, the show's creators clearly view this story as contemporary. There are recurring discussions of endless wars in which the objectives seem to keep shifting. The government manipulates information and civil rights are sacrificed to a prying big brother, allegedly for society's protection. And interestingly, for those of you who've seen it, one of the things the review doesn't mention is that the O'Brien's interrogation in room 101 of Winston Smith is directly staged as the interrogations at Abu Ghraib. Now, the play, too, was revived in 2019 with Tim Robbins now starring in the role of O'Brien, his first stage appearance in many, many years. And this brings us to our present, my final date, because we've seen, as I'm sure you all know, in the last 6 years, another real upswing of interest in the novel. On the one hand, as this is the result of the 2016 presidential election. And already in September 2016, David Brooks would proclaim on his new show, and so we are really in Orwell land. We are in 1984. And it's interesting that an authoritarian personality type comes in at the same time with a complete disrespect for even tangential relationships to the truth, that words are unmoored. And it's really interesting here that what Brooks is doing, right, in his reading is shifting away from really had what been the dominant reading, whether in its conservative or left interpretations of the novel, that it's about the power of the big state. And now it becomes turned into the power of the authoritarian individual. And I think this is the reading that really dominates the present. And then, of course, we have the issue that we're dealing with today in Florida, which is the return of all kinds of censorships. Now, I want to skip over an issue today so we can have a little time for some conversation at the end about the a version of what I think of as a kind of academic censorship, which is the highbrow dismissal of the novel as not literature. And this was personally affected me, but I can talk about that in discussion if anyone's interested. What I want to turn to now is the way in which censorship itself is presented in the novel, right? Because we have the vision at the climax novel of the forced torture conversion of Winston Smith, what would be popularly referred to at this moment as brainwashing, which Lionel Trilling describes as a hideous parody on psychotherapy. But the real mind control, I'd suggest, occurs elsewhere in the novel. And this is in the oceanic states limiting of access to different experiences. And this is what Orwell writes in the indispensable Newspeak appendix, which again for him is the real ending of the novel. Newspeak was designed not to extend, but to diminish the range of thought. And this purpose was indirectly assisted by cutting the choice of words down to a minimum. Now, a really interesting scene a little earlier in the novel related to this is when Winston is first meeting with O'Brien, when he thinks O'Brien is part of a revolutionary group attempting to overthrow the oceanic state. And Orwell writes, O'Brien took the decanter by the neck and filled up the glasses with a dark red liquid. It aroused in Winston dim memories of something seen long ago on a wall or a hoarding, a vast bottle composed of electric lights which seemed to move up and down and pour its contents into a glass. Seen from the top, the stuff looked almost black, but in the decanter it gloomed like a ruby. It had a sour, sweet smell. He saw Julia pick up her glass and sniff at it with frank curiosity. "It is called wine," said O'Brien with a faint smile. "You will have read about it in books, no doubt. Not much of it gets to the outer party, I am afraid." Winston then tastes this, and it's the conclusion here that I think most important for Orwell. Actually, when he came to swallow it, the stuff was distinctly disappointing. The truth was that after years of gin drinking, he could barely taste it. He set down the empty glass. Now, I think what interestingly Orwell is emphasizing here, and this is a concern for many intellectuals in his moment, and in fact was a concern at the very founding of the modern public university after World War II. That the ability to appreciate, to engage with, to listen, right, to complex arguments is not a natural one, but it needs to be cultivated through a long process of education, right? And so what we see then is the real alternate to the gramophone mind readings of 1984, which would be to actually read the novel itself. And this requires, I want to suggest, paying close attention to its details. And this, to pay attention to these details, is to engage in a real dialogue, first with the work itself, and then with other people, right? Now, this is what a group who came to prominence in the same years as 1984 was first introduced. This group of critics called New Critics, they called this close reading. Close reading was central to the creation of a whole new system of public education after World War II, and also for the defense of democracy against neo-fascism. And so by way of conclusion, and very briefly, I just want to look at two passages in the novel that I think bear out the importance of this kind of close reading, this kind of attention to the details of the work. And the first occurs when Winston Smith first enters the shop run by the shopkeeper, Mr. Charrington. Charrington is, you might recall, the person who's in fact an agent of the thought police and will engineer his capture later on. But at this point, Winston Smith finds a glass paperweight with a piece of Indian Ocean coral in it, and Winston says, "It's a beautiful thing." Charrington responds, "It's a beautiful thing, but there's not many that say so nowadays." He coughed. "Now, if it so happened that you wanted to buy it, that'd cost you $4. I can remember when a thing like that would have fetched £8. And £8 was, well, I can't work it out, but it was a lot of money." Okay? Now, I think this passage, and I've written a lot about this, is that it's so significant because what it shows is that Airstrip 1, which remember is simply a minor outpost of Oceania, is not a Great Britain dominated by the Soviet Union. It's a Great Britain dominated by the United States. And this leads into Orwell's real concern throughout the novel, and this is something that he writes about throughout his essays in the last decades of his life, is what he sees as the real detrimental effects of contemporary mass culture. The way that mass culture narrows itself, functions like a form of newspeak, narrows the range of possible experiences, of possible encounters. Now, it's interesting that in the film adaptation, this is shortened to simply cost you $4. And for me, what this indicates in my reading here is that the central concern about the global domination of the US for Orwell has been forgotten because that battle's been won. US culture, by the time we get to the 1980s, seems to be the global dominant. Now, this also points toward another change that occurs at the climax of the film. And I'd like to show one short clip, and then we can end there and open up for discussion. Thanks. And this starts in the middle. Take it forward. No. Thought it would have held it at the place. We don't want to watch the whole movie. I think you probably got better things to do today. I do recommend. Yeah.
We must meet again.
Okay, good. This is the conclusion of the plot itself. No newspeak appendix in it.
I accuse myself of the following crimes. I have seduced party members of both sexes. I've been to the proletarian areas. I deliberately contracted syphilis in order to spread the disease to my wife and other party members. Together with other agents, I have counterfeited banknotes, wrecked industrial machinery, polluted the water supply, guided Eurasian rocket bombs to targets on Airstrip 1 by means of coded radio signals. I stand here a victim of the influence of Emmanuel Goldstein, guilty on all counts. I'm glad I was caught. I was mentally deranged. Now I am cured. I ask only for you to accept my love of our leader. I ask only to be shot while my mind is still clean.
A glorious victory. A vast strategic maneuver to outflank the Eurasian forces on the African front has been successful. Perfectly coordinated, it has resulted in the utter rout of the Eurasian army. There have been nearly 1 million prisoners. It has been an utter rout, a complete demoralization of the Eurasian enemy. This immense victory brings the war within measurable distance of its end.
Wonderful news.
It's in the center. Yeah. Two aspects that changes that are really subtle here, but I think they utterly transform Orwell's meaning. The first is the moment when Winston is tracing in the dust 2 + 2 equals, Notice that what he doesn't in the film, write the 5. It just ends at 2 + 2 equals. The other change is the final paragraph of the novel, or of the narrative proper. He gazed up at the enormous face. 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breath. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the side of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother. It's great that they gave the subtitles in this presentation, because notice the shift here. He loved Big Brother to I love you, right? With the shift to the first person, and in fact, what's happening here is the shift to probably the most consequential change Orwell introduces into the genre of the dystopias that existed up to this point, which is a shift from the first person narrative to the third, is it opens up a tremendous ambiguity, right? These 2 details. Because the I love you could be, and that would be our first assumption, referring to Big Brother on the screen. But Radford brilliantly here leaves open the possibility that he's saying he's referring to Julia, right? And that in fact, the conditioning has failed. That the terror of this world that Orwell portrays is its absolute closure, its ability to end all history. Remember, the original title working title for Orwell of 1984 was The Last Man in Europe. Right, is the vision of the end of history itself. Here we see that nightmare no longer seems to be in effect. But recently, there's been a discussion that suggests maybe even that wasn't Orwell's vision, that there's been a lot of attention to his own dissatisfaction, that he was finishing the novel when he was in a tuberculosis sanatorium, very near his death. And a very recent article has pointed out that in the first British edition, 2 + 2 = 5 is in fact printed. And that will be the basis for all the subsequent US editions. But there's actually a second impression a few months later, while Orwell was still alive and known to have been participating in the correction of his manuscript. In the second impression of the first edition, the 5 has been stamped out. And it's clear it was done externally. It wasn't an accident, because the equal sign has been damaged in the type. In the third impression of the first British edition, the 5 is restored, right, here. But then by the second edition, right, it's been removed again. And all British editions of 1984, and this is what the film is actually, in that scene, it's not a change of the British edition, it's a change of the US edition until the late 1980s, after the film was made. A critic in Britain noticed this discrepancy from the first edition in the Americans and said it needs to be restored. This was Orwell's intent. But in fact, the discovery of these other impressions suggests that Orwell, in fact, wanted it removed. And that, combined with the Newspeak appendix, right, which is written in the past tense, right? It refers to Oceania as something that has ended. Suggests that Orwell himself wanted to convey that no kind of regime, right, like this can ever be eternal. It can't be eternal if we do the things to fight for a democratic society. And this brings us, I think, right back again to our present, that what is really at stake in the Orwellian Orwellian present of Florida is in fact, democracy itself. That the efforts at voter suppression combined with legislative mandated changes in public education, and notice that none of these changes, right, will affect the governor's alma mater of Yale, that what these end up doing is undermining any opportunity to actually cultivate the hard-earned skill of reading or listening or experiencing that is fundamental to democracy. And what Orwell is teaching us, right, is to lose that skill, to lose not only the ability to express ourselves, but to be able to listen, right, is to lose democracy itself. So thank you for listening today, and I'd love to talk further.
All right, we still have a big crowd on Zoom.
Good.
Do you want to help me with questions? Sure. If anybody has questions? Question?
Can I ask a little question? I was curious. We didn't talk about the format. Had people read the novel again recently as part of your discussion? Okay, that's fine.
Okay, I have a couple questions here on Zoom. Rick Gold, if you'd like to unmute.
Well, I see Rick out there. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for a very insightful presentation.
Thank you.
You finished up with a mention of the end of history, and it reminded me of Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which came out, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, I guess now, that basically said that with the fall of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe, that was liberal democracy had prevailed, and that there was no need to focus on any challenges in the future, if I'm summarizing it correctly. And I was wondering if you could talk about perhaps some similarities and differences between what you interpreted Orwell meaning by this.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. I think that's dead on. I had mentioned early in the talk Fukuyama's essay as well. It's a very influential document at the end of the Cold War. He publishes the original essay version of it in 1989, and the more extended, well, I think it's 1992, is the more extended book version of this discussion. And I'm really fascinated, and in fact, this is sort of what the new book is all about, is that it's precisely in these moments where the struggle against authoritarian or totalitarian sort of formations, be it the fascist one of individual domination or that of the state, the big state apparatus, it's precisely in those moments, like the 1980s, that interest in Orwell's book seems to wane, where it seems to, and it was the Fukuyama thesis is history is over because the great struggles are no longer occurring, right? The great struggles, which were defined for him as the struggles of parliamentary democracies against fascism and then against state communism in the Soviet Union. And so Fukuyama's original essay is really interesting because he's very ambiguous about this, if you'll recall. For him, it's all we're then going to be the great struggles that have defined, that have created this great epic of creativity in modern human history is at the end, and all we're going to see is tinkerings, sort of little local skirmishes and different kind of problem solving. But the heroic age of humanity has come to its end. Now, by the end of the 90s, right, this vision had been roundly refuted, right? The growing concern with the effects of Islamic terrorism. And this is what led to both a declaration of the re-beginnings of history, and Fukuyama even withdrew his own claim. He said, I was wrong. I didn't take into consideration these other concerns. And it's interesting, again, that comes back to another moment of the revival of Orwell's, which is the very different sense of the end of history, right, that can be mobilized in various ways as fixing the regime, right, that currently exists forever. Right? The great line in 1984 from O'Brien, if you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever, right? That's the Orwell's very different vision, right, of the end of history, that we'll see local tinkerings, but the system itself is inviolable. And it's interesting how much that vision, again, has got revived in the moment of the war on terror. Now I think the interest in 1984 actually recovers its original context much more effectively, that there was a wide-scale interest, right, in the moment after the Second World War of not only the threats, right, despite the popular representations of this, there were a lot of people involved, probably people here, right, who were involved in the creation of the new university in the US and in Europe, in the reconstruction of Germany, in the United Kingdom, that saw us at a moment where this kind of authoritarianism represented by fascism could come back. And this is what they created, that Thomas Jefferson argued in his essays on the formation of the university in Virginia, that a university has two responsibilities in a democracy: to educate us for what he calls economic goods, which is the ability to get a good job or provide a livelihood for yourself and your family, and what he calls political goods, which is the skills, right, the difficult skills necessary to participate in a democracy, which are not natural, right? There's a great essay that came out right before the 2016 election, The Virtues of an Educated Voter, by the historian Alan Taylor, who Taylor shows that this vision was largely ignored in Virginia and the United States until the end of the Second World War. And when this threat was still imminent, right, of this possibility, and this led to another early reading that I didn't talk about, links 1984, not to the Soviet Union, but to McCarthy himself, right? And we're seeing this great competition over 1984 at this moment. It's this vision I want to suggest that in this moment of the full abandoning of that project, right, is coming back in our reading of Orwell. And the real interest in our moment now is about Orwell's vision of, in fact, the dismantling of education, far more serious than the forms of direct censorship, right, of removing things, which are very difficult, right, in the age of electronic media, but the transformation of education, the transformation of it only into an economic good, the undermining of the humanities, right, as a central part, the skills that are necessary for a democracy. And it's that vision. So I hope that begins to answer a really interesting point and question.
Any other questions here?
You said there were a couple.
Tom George, I know I saw your hand. You can unmute if you have a question.
Yeah, it looked like Orwell was living and writing in England at the time. They had some really major scandals in British intelligence, the Cambridge Five and all that. Did that have any impact in his thinking and his writing? Yeah,
it's a great question. There's been a lot of interest, really, and actually in the years since I finished my first book, about Orwell's own involvement in British intelligence at the time, and that Orwell himself was wrestling continuously in his thinking, and you can see it in his essays. And these essays appear in a whole new light about the question of when, in fact, would the suppression of certain kind of speech be necessary, right? There's an essay, again, if I had forever to talk, which I would happily do to you, for all of you here, is actually a published essay directly contemporaneous with his preface from 1944 to Animal Farm, where Orwell takes that question up directly, because someone writes in a critique to the newspaper he's an editor for, a critique of a poem that critiques the war effort. And he gets a lot of letters saying, you can't publish this right now. You're a traitor for publishing this. And Orwell in that essay says, yes, there will be times where one needs to suppress certain information, but that does not constitute the expression of different views or different opinions, right? That kind of contest can't be ended. And so it's something he's wrestling with this whole time that he's working on these things. And it leads, interestingly, to a whole other long debate in the different readings. Is Winston Smith a hero, or is he himself an absolute failure in all of this? And it also has something to do with a kind of the thoroughgoingness of Orwell's own devastating critique in this. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Any other questions here? Mallory, final thoughts?
Well, I certainly think that it was a very enjoyable, thorough, and interesting presentation. I am so glad because, as I've remarked, Orwell is certainly crucial and central to this argument that we're talking about here of what should we say? Ignorance is strength, freedom is slavery, and so on and so forth. So those are certain tenets from the book that certainly ring true today and that we are grappling with every day when we listen to the news and also the alternative facts. So thank you so much, Dr. Wegner. We appreciate your help.
Can I say one thing real quick in conclusion too? I wanted to thank all of you. I mean, this is really was important for me to come talk to, because I know most of the people here are been deeply involved with education and were part of the great university experiment after the war that I benefited from immensely myself. I talked about, but I had to skip today, that I went to a second-tier university as an undergraduate in Southern California and had the opportunity in this unique moment to take up this kind of work that I love so deeply. So I did want to thank you all for everything you've done, because you really are the people who challenge the world that Orwell is really interested in. And so it also, if you'd like to keep the conversation going, again, feel free to drop me an email address. I also would have liked, if I had the time today, to put a little bibliography together of the things. I'd still be happy to do that, because I think part of the most important work we can do. I always tell people that scandalously did this at a lecture in Greece a few years ago, said, I really wish I could brainwash my students, that I could make them my army because I believe my values are the right ones. But in fact, as anyone who teaches knows, that you can't do that. All you can do is expose people. It's give them the skills to find things for themselves. And that was part of my interest today, is just to share with you some different texts that I found really interesting, and some I'd recently discovered because of this opportunity. So thank you again, and I hope this is a beginning, not an end.
Remember to come up and look at the resources
Yes,
here on the
and
table.
yeah.
And also next week, we're going to be taking up the subject of banned children's books, for which there is currently an enormous amount of apparent enthusiasm. And Ramona Carpenegro is going to be here with us to talk about what's happening on that level. So thank you very much. We'll see you next week.